For the first time in 7 years, we'll be returning to Gotham City in a new, full-on action-packed Batman-related game with Gotham Knights in just mere days. We've had to wait a long time for a game from either Rocksteady or WB Montreal, and we're finally here, and I could not be more excited. But before we soak in the future of Batman-related games, let's take a stroll down memory lane. If you don't know me, I'm Barrett Courtney, and last year I made a series of videos talking about Batman Arkham and what makes each game in the series special in their own way. And to get hyped for the release of Gotham Knights, I compiled all 4 of those videos into one big video so we can take one final look back at this classic video game franchise. So whether you're watching these videos for the first time or you're enjoying them again as you wait for your copy of Gotham Knights to arrive in the mail, sit back, relax, and get nostalgic with me as we take a look back at what made each game in the Batman Arkham series so special. During a time in my life where I was lapsed out of video games besides Rock Band and Skate 2, I discovered a teaser for Batman Arkham Asylum, and it had been the first game in a while to really grab my attention. I loved Batman, and seeing a game for him that wasn't just a tie-in for a movie or show really piqued my interest. I was able to pick it up a month after it came out, and it was really the perfect game to play during the week of Halloween. The unsettling atmosphere and not knowing what would be around the corner really captured this sense of unease and fear playing as Batman. I've said this many times, but I fell in love with Arkham Asylum on that first playthrough back in high school, and it's not just because it was a Batman game. I was noticing ways in which the game was designed to specifically keep me on the edge of my seat the entire way through. It was the first superhero game that I had played that didn't feel like a quick cash-in. Rocksteady had perfectly implemented the ethos of Batman into almost every aspect of the game, and every time I go back to it, I feel like I discover or rediscover another layer in which they did just that. It was the title that got me back into video games. Welcome to the first episode of the Arkham Files, a KindaFunny Games mini-series where I, Barrett Courtney, look back at what made each game in the Batman Arkham franchise so special. Today, let's talk about designing fear in the game where it all started. Of course, before we dive deep, let's look back at what made Batman Arkham Asylum a standout hit. We saw the return of the definitive voices of Batman and Joker with Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill, which really made this feel like a spiritual successor to the Batman animated series universe. And honestly, I think this game really let both actors go all out in their performances. While the animated series was upheld for how dark and gritty it was for a kids show, Arkham Asylum seemed to want to push that even further. The combat, while feeling sluggish now compared to its follow-ups, flowed so well and truly simulated the ease of Batman fighting crime. That, mixed with the Predator mode to help stoke fear into your enemies, really nailed the fear that Batman brings out in his prey. The game was also heightened by its inspiration from Metroidvania design. Circling back to areas you couldn't get to before by unlocking certain gadgets helped keep the feeling like everything you came across was important. And it was honestly this that made high school Barrett open up his eyes to how great game design could be. Especially with trying to 100% the game by getting everything left behind by the Riddler, I'd been opened up to what good collectibles could be, and not just the filler collectathons that I grew up loving. Speaking of the Riddler, his presence opened up a way for the devs to really flesh out this world, while not having to sacrifice the very focused and small-scale story. I loved solving riddles that would open up a character bio to Ratcatcher or Killer Moth of all villains, which also leads to the menu and UI design in Asylum, which I believe are the best in the entire series. It keeps that dark and stylized comic book feel and contrasts well with the gothic and realistic looking world design. All of these things, mixed with the score that also doesn't hesitate to harken back to the animated series, and the fucked up interpretation of Batman's rogues gallery. Whether it's fighting off Zsasz from making another mark, seeing Killer Croc possibly eat Scarecrow, Scarecrow making Batman re-experience some terrible things in his life, Rocksteady was not afraid of throwing us into the deep end of how messed up Batman's world can be. All of these elements made a fantastic game, but there's something below the surface that I believe still makes Arkham Asylum a thrill to play today. I've played this game dozens of times at this point, so I've definitely become desensitized to what the devs wanted us to experience while playing. So I've really had to think back to the first time I played this game and how unsettling it was the entire time. Of course, I am a big baby when playing scary games.
Okay.
Oh, I don't like that shit. Ah!
And while Arkham Asylum is definitely on the lighter side of being quote-unquote scary, there's still something masterfully done from a design standpoint to really make you feel like you're Batman on one of his worst nights. Of course, it's Batman. He's as prepared as he can be, but being stuck on Arkham Island throughout the entire game with limited resources while the Joker runs amok really makes you feel like you're at a disadvantage, which honestly, Batman experiences all the time. While for the most part you have the bells and whistles of Batman, you always feel one step behind your foes, which purposefully limits the feeling of Batman at his full potential. Rocksteady has said before that they wanted cutscenes in Arkham Asylum to be used to constantly change the goals of the player or modify the importance of the steps they take to bring down the Joker. To me, that mindset helps the feeling of accomplishment being always just out of reach. I remember on my first playthrough that while I had little accomplishments like neutralizing Bane or capturing Harley, I knew this was all by Joker's design. And it's that simple fact right there that kept that sense of unease until the final cutscene. This entire night is all a part of Joker's game. His henchmen have been busted out, and even though it's an island with a few different buildings, it's still a small island, and Joker's crew constantly have their guard up. They're expecting you. One of the producers of Arkham Asylum, Nathan Burlow, cited BioShock as another influence for the game, with BioShock's unique narrative and atmosphere. If we dig a little deeper into this influence, BioShock is another game where you never feel fully in control of what's happening in the City of Rapture. And I believe this bled into some of the design philosophy for Arkham Asylum. While you definitely have more skill as Batman than Jack from BioShock, taking down enemies in brawls or as an apex predator constantly evolve with new enemy types or familiar environments being changed to up the ante. You constantly have to adapt. You just never knew what the game was going to throw at you the first time you played it. You never felt fully in control, especially with some of the boss fights. While the final Joker fight was never great, the fixed camera angle while Joker lunges at you makes you feel so small in the face of certain death. The Poison Ivy fight, while also hokey, is similar where you slowly whittle away at the health bar of a 50-foot plant. And while not necessarily a traditional boss fight, one of my favorite boss encounters in the entire series, Killer Croc, really keeps you on the edge of your seat because you find yourself exploring a maze with Killer Croc always on your tail. This encounter perfectly encapsulates how I feel about this game as a whole. You never feel fully in control. And even after leaving Croc's lair, you don't feel like you can breathe a sigh of relief just yet. For years, Arkham fans have debated time and time again about which is better, Asylum or City. And while I typically find myself arguing for the sequel, something that often gets overlooked in the fight for Asylum is how the game is masterfully designed around feeling some sort of fear throughout your entire night on Arkham Island. Like I said earlier, you have all of the bells and whistles as Batman, but Batman was only so prepared for this night, and because of that, almost failed at defeating the Joker. And that feeling of almost failing, but coming out on top at the very last moment is the most Batman thing to feel. How does one follow up on catching lightning in a bottle? Especially when that lightning was the first successful step for modern superhero games, with its focus on implementing the ethos of the title character into every stitch of gameplay, perfectly balancing the scales of power between you, the player, and the world you feel trapped in. Arkham Asylum did so much right that was applauded by many, so we can only imagine how the team at Rocksteady felt about how to follow up on the 2009 hit. The easy route, which a lot of other studios would have done, would be to do it all again. Keep it all in another relatively small area, improve some specific design choices, keep the same exact tone that leans on horror and thriller elements, add a new gadget or two. Bing bang boom, you've got a game that most would probably still enjoy. But in all honesty, when something as special as Arkham Asylum comes out, to just do that again wouldn't hit the same. That moment has passed. To truly keep everyone's attention after catching lightning in a bottle, you have to do something different, something unexpected. So how do you truly follow up on catching lightning in a bottle? You open the bottle and see where the lightning goes next. Welcome to the second episode of the Arkham Files, a KindaFunny Games mini-series where I, Barrett Courtney, look back at what made each game in the Batman Arkham franchise so special. Today, let's talk about becoming fear in the game that truly evolved the series, Batman Arkham City. When I first played Arkham City back in high school, even with how obsessed with it I was, watching every possible trailer and reading every theory I could before release, I truly didn't know what to expect. That first playthrough blew my mind. Upon revisiting, the story does admittedly have some issues with pacing and focus, but there's just so many amazing moments in this game that I still think about all the time. The gradual expansion of this universe from Asylum to City really lets this series go even deeper into Batman's lore than it could in the first. With side missions that followed up on threads from Asylum or referencing some of my favorite stories from the comics, City really felt like Rocksteady pulling out all of the stops, which for me felt so impressive for a sequel that came out only 2 years later. Now, of course, City's more open nature didn't grab everyone, with a lot of people preferring Asylum's smaller scale world with heavy Metroidvania design. People who prefer Asylum usually talk about how City's more open world nature makes it a less unique experience. And while I can't deny that City is definitely a bigger game, I don't think it loses any uniqueness. I just think it's a different type of unique. I really enjoy how my friend Alex O'Neill puts it.
If Asylum was the Metroidvania of the series, then Arkham City is the Link to the Past. Each area has a dungeon, whether it's Joker's Steel Mill, Penguin's Museum, or Ra's al Ghul's Hidden City. You usually spend a little time in each dungeon, then acquire a new ability or gadget partway through that helps you get out of said dungeon. These specific domains help each villain have their own moment while also developing their own atmosphere, much like each Zelda dungeon typically correlates to its own element. All the while, those tools received from those same domains naturally translate to finding even more nooks and crannies when you return to the open city. Zelda is an open world, but you don't think of it as an open world game because of the condensed nature of specific areas, either for dungeons or crannies alike.
And I believe that's why I never understood why people point at Arkham City being an open world as a negative. Yes, it's bigger than Asylum, but the heavy attention to detail and design in each segmented area never made it feel like a generic Ubisoft game that spreads itself way too thin. Rocksteady evolved the series in what it needed to be, except for maybe all of those Riddler trophies. In the last decade, the term "it makes you feel like" has been used a lot when talking about games. And while a lot of us in the industry get teased whenever we say this, we do have to remember that is the goal for a lot of video games today, to truly put you in the shoes of the character that you're playing as. And to this day, I think Arkham City still does it the best. Now, on the surface level, that can be pretty obvious with things I mentioned before, like the improved flow of combat and having more gadgets at your disposal. There seemed to be this desire from the developers to flip the design philosophy from Asylum. I talked about in my Asylum video about how almost everything on a design level was made to make the player feel a lack of control, and in doing that, kept them in a feeling of unease. Batman wasn't fully prepared for that night. But in Arkham City, from the jump, it feels like the complete opposite. Rocksteady has even said in interviews how they wanted players to have full access to all of the gadgets from Asylum at the very beginning of the game to make the player feel like Batman has been preparing for this night. While how he got into Arkham City wasn't exactly as he planned, Batman was ready. With that simple decision on a gameplay level, the player can feel that power dynamic shift in their favor. But also with the bigger environment this time around and how the story is set up, the game subtly instills more of a feeling of Batman at his full potential. Almost every event that happened in Arkham Asylum was, for the most part, by Joker's design. Enemies were on full alert and expecting you, so they were all working together because they all knew that they were part of your only goal, which was to stop the Joker. So while you did feel like Batman to an extent, there was a feeling of restriction, whereas in Arkham City, the game covers several districts of Gotham with multiple enemy factions fighting for power in this messed up prison experiment. These two elements give Batman the upper hand by actually having the element of surprise. And while things feel easier for Batman this time around, with enemies either not expecting to even see Batman that night or being distracted by this gang war going on, it gives the player almost an endless ceiling on how to best strike fear into the heart of the enemy. Criminals are a superstitious and cowardly lot. Here are endless tools to take advantage of that. You are no longer stuck in the asylum with them. They are stuck in this city with you. It's because of this power shift to make you truly feel like Batman that makes the Mr. Freeze fight stand out so much. It shifts back into the design philosophy of Asylum because it's a fight Batman wasn't fully prepared for. While it's a familiar terrain, Freeze has truly made it his own, taking the feeling of control away from you. People could use this as an example to argue that Arkham Asylum's design philosophy is better, but I would argue that Freeze's fight stands out so much because it goes against the grain of the rest of the game. Getting the player to feel comfortable for most of the game, only to take it away for such a formidable foe, is honestly a stroke of genius, and it's why I think it's still the best boss fight in the series. But back to my overall point about why this game is the best at making you feel like the character you're playing as, and it can honestly be summed up in the first 15 minutes of the game. Bruce Wayne gets arrested and thrown into Arkham City. The first time the player is given actual control is when Bruce is tied to a chair, which I believe is a visual metaphor for the gameplay. They want you to feel constricted. You get thrown into the prison with absolutely nothing but your good looks, and you have to fight some penguin goons while still handcuffed. Then you break free of this visual constriction, and just moments later, you break free of your gameplay constriction. Up until this moment in the Arkham games, you felt constrained. But then there's that moment of release. You put on the cowl and glide off a building to either save Catwoman from Two-Face, or you can save Jack Ryder from some unsuspecting goons. Either way, your first fight in this game is going to scare the crap out of someone. The gloves are off this time around. You are Batman. They know it, and because of that, you actually feel it. So where do you go after City? Like I said at the beginning of this video, most companies would just try to do the same thing over again. And with that comes the rise of WB Games Montreal, who had to find their place in a world that they did not create. WB Montreal was dealt a terrible hand. With the success of Arkham Asylum and City, Rocksteady had a lot to think about when it came to following up some of the most praised modern-day superhero games. And the thing they needed the most was time. WB was willing to give that to them, but with the caveat of keeping the release schedule of a Batman Arkham game every 2 years. And with giving Rocksteady the time they needed to complete their trilogy, WB looked to their Montreal studio to fill in the gap and release a game in 2013. WB Montreal had only worked on smaller projects before being given the task of staving off hungry fans. So Arkham Origins was truly the moment for them to prove themselves as a full-blown studio. Unfortunately, it's hard to prove yourself when you're put into a box. Arkham Origins came out to a bunch of shrugs. It was the first game in the series that didn't make everyone's head turn. It felt like it just kind of came and went, and when people talk about the legacy of the Arkham series, I feel like Arkham Origins is frequently ignored. And while to many people, Origins came off as a jack of all trades, I do believe one aspect of the game that truly makes it special doesn't get talked about enough, and it's in the title, the true origin of Batman. Welcome to the third episode of the Arkham Files, a KindaFunny Games mini-series where I, Barrett Courtney, look back at what made each game in the Batman Arkham franchise so special. Today, let's look back at the middle child of the series, Arkham Origins, and talk about the importance of discovering fear as Batman. So what was the reason for Origins always feeling like it got left behind? If we look at the game we got on a surface level, there are a few factors. The moment-to-moment gameplay and overall design felt like a copy of Arkham City, if the copier left a few smudges here and there. Arkham City stood out for how different it felt from Asylum, but Origins didn't really have that same level of innovation, which is fine. City's gameplay was great, so why not just do it again? Again, the headspace WB was in was not to improve, or to even think about design philosophy on a deeper level tied to the ethos of Batman. It was just to get something out. It almost felt like a step backward from the level of detail that both Asylum and City had. Gotham itself feels kind of lifeless, which you could blame on only criminals hanging out during this winter storm, but there's just a lack of detail and imagination into fleshing out the city that made it very uninteresting to explore. That, mixed with half of the map being ripped from City during a time of year we've also seen before, and that fucking bridge. It's all of this and the truly uninteresting Enigma trophies that created the biggest sin of the game, exploring around wasn't rewarding enough. And for those parts of the game being major parts, I do understand why Arkham Origins doesn't get talked about as much as the other games. Hell, it doesn't even get the other end of the discussions where people won't shut up about how much they hate it. It's seriously neither. It wasn't extraordinary on either end of the spectrum. It was fine, which does make it forgettable. In my video for City, I talked about the reason it was so special was how different it was from Asylum, and any lesser company / developer would have just followed up Asylum with more Asylum. Here we got to actually see what more of the same in the series would look like, and it's underwhelming. People have concerns with Gotham Knight since WB Montreal worked on Arkham Origins, but we have to remember how constrained WB Montreal was. This was a prequel game in a universe and with gameplay design the team hadn't created themselves. They were put in a very constricting box, so there was only so much they could do. And while there isn't much to say about the gameplay elements of Origins, I do think there's one aspect that the game succeeded with that not enough people talk about: the story. WB Montreal were clear in the marketing for this game that while the game is called Arkham Origins, it wasn't the very beginning of Batman's career. He's not tripping over his cape, and he knows how to fight a group of baddies and not get overwhelmed. So what's the origin story being told here, besides the silly origin of Arkham Asylum at the end of the game? It's the beginning of Bruce Wayne actually understanding who Batman needs to be. Every superhero has their growing pains. And for Batman, it's thinking he just needs to be better than his opponent. Whether that's in strength or knowledge, he needs to be ahead. And in the typical early days of Batman, his way of thinking works for the most part with the type of criminals he grew up with. But Batman's presence always invites a new class of criminal into Gotham. And in Origins, this new class of criminal is invited for one night to kill Batman. And that's where Bruce is shown how wrong he is about who Batman needs to be. With villains tougher like Bane and more clever and chaotic like Joker, Bruce is now fighting his war incorrectly. In this universe, young Bruce has been coming at his war against crime in Gotham from a place of anger. And while anger for people can be a major drive, it often makes us sloppy. You see that anger in Roger Craig Smith's performance, who I think is amazing as a younger Bruce in this game. He not only does a great job emulating a younger version of Kevin Conroy's Batman, he also plays the less mature Bruce, the Bruce who hasn't learned the key lesson yet, phenomenally. The most important key for Batman is fear. And while this younger Bruce is seen experimenting with how to use that against his enemies throughout the game, when we meet him at the beginning of Origins, he doesn't realize yet that fear needs to go both ways. Batman needs fear, not anger, to truly become the hero he needs to be. He tried so long shutting himself off from fear since the death of his parents, but he also shut himself off from the feeling of what it's like to lose. And throughout Origins, we see Bruce go on that very important journey of being reminded that he also needs fear to truly keep him driven and to constantly remind himself how much he has to lose and how scary that really is. One of my favorite moments in the entire Arkham series is when Batman discovers Joker's hotel and sees for the first time what this new villain is capable of. We get hints of something grand about to happen when we first get into the hotel, but when we walk into Joker's demented carnival, Batman says,
"What is this?"
It's not much, but there always felt like a subtle hint of fear in Roger Craig Smith's performance that I absolutely love. That entire hotel sequence, Bane knowing Batman's identity and almost failing at taking down Firefly, reminds Bruce that he has so much at stake constantly, and he finally admits that he can't take on all of these fears alone. He finally accepts the help of Alfred and Gordon, and it's all inspired by his fear of losing to this new class of criminal. Especially when it crescendos into Alfred almost dying, Bruce is reminded of why he's doing this in the first place, and accepts that role Batman needs to have in Gotham and the headspace he needs to be in to succeed at that. Arkham Origins nails Batman's origin story. Like I said earlier, it's not the typical origin story of Bruce putting on the cowl for the first time, but it's the story of Bruce discovering what he truly needs to become Batman: fear. WB Montreal got the short end of the stick, being forced into a box to make something in a universe that wasn't fully theirs. But with the little tools they were given, they showed that they truly understand the important aspects of Batman. And it's because of Origins of why I'm excited for Gotham Knights. It's their own universe to play around in from a gameplay and design standpoint. And since they've already proven themselves story-wise, I'm confident that they're going to deliver a story that's truly special. And with Origins' release, Rocksteady was given the time to figure out how they wanted to end their Batman Arkham trilogy, which was a big question for everyone. I mean, you could continue the pattern the trilogy was going so far and go somewhere completely different with it, like what City did after Asylum, or you could end the trilogy by mixing together the best elements from the first two games to make it all come to a satisfying conclusion. What is the best way to end a trilogy? Of course, there are plenty of obvious answers when it comes to ending any story, trilogy or not. The core of those answers are always the same thing. It needs to be satisfying enough to make the journey feel worthwhile. When it comes to specifically a trilogy, however, I do think there is an added layer that needs to be considered, and that is to find the best way to mix the tone and sensations of the first two installments in the story. It helps the entire trilogy come together and feel whole. For example, while Return of the Jedi gets teased for just how silly it can get, I do think there is a good balance between the campiness from A New Hope and the more serious philosophical tone from Empire Strikes Back to really make the original Star Wars trilogy feel like one cohesive story and not just three separate movies. And to me, Batman Arkham Knight does that as well. While it gets harped on for not necessarily adding anything new besides the Batmobile, which you'll know we'll talk about at some point, I think the game overall does a fantastic job at wrapping up the story Rocksteady wanted to tell with Batman. Welcome to the finale of the Arkham Files, a KindaFunny Games mini-series where I, Barrett Courtney, look back at what made each game in the Batman Arkham franchise so special. To wrap it all up, let's take a look at Batman Arkham Knight and how it brought a satisfying conclusion to Rocksteady's Batman. Before we get into the deep stuff, let's take a quick look at the surface of this game and why there was so much conversation around it at release. Something that doesn't get talked about enough is how good this game is on a technical level still to this day. I would argue that it's still one of the best looking games from last gen, all while playing the best in the entire series, except that PC port at launch. With Batman's upgraded suit, free-flow combat feels the best it ever has, with a large variety of gadgets at your disposal, and not to mention the myriad of enemy types and locations that make every fight feel unique. And even stealth sections have a really quick and even more satisfying feel to them. From a pure gameplay standpoint, this game truly makes you feel like you're in Batman's prime, despite it being the last night that Bruce wears the cowl. Moment to moment, this game is the most fun to play because of that. Arkham Knight feels more like an open world than its predecessor, with 3 full islands to explore, an entire wheel full of side missions, enemy tower-like activities, and a bunch of Riddler trophies to collect. But even with all of that, Rocksteady didn't miss a beat and somehow even improved the level of detail they're known for having. Gotham has never looked this good in a game, from a technical standpoint and even aesthetically. Rocksteady's Gotham finds an interesting balance between Arkham Asylum's classic gothic tone and Arkham City's more modern city feel. To me, it was honestly the first time outside of a comic book that the city of Gotham felt right. In both my Asylum and City videos, I talked about the balance of control and power between Batman and his foes. Asylum leaned heavily towards your enemies having more power, and City leaned the opposite, showing the player two sides of Batman's life. A night where he feels powerless, and a night where he has all of the power. Knight has a lot of the same open world design philosophy from Arkham City that makes you feel like the Dark Knight at peak performance. But then on the story side of things, you always feel one step behind Scarecrow and the Arkham Knight, and there are even some gameplay instances where you don't feel like the one truly in control. It brings back the feeling so many miss from Arkham Asylum, that you have no real control on how this night is going to play out. It's all by their design. And I think Knight does a great job of giving you both the design philosophies of Asylum and City. Now let's talk about what shines brightest in this game.
Talk about the Batmobile!
Okay, fine. The Batmobile has both strengths and weaknesses. The major weakness that I do tend to agree with are the stealth fights, which definitely feel forced. They just aren't interesting and are, in my opinion, the lowest parts of the game. Another low point is the Deathstroke boss fight, which should have been another fun hand-to-hand combat scenario, but turns into a reskin of the Cloudburst battle. I'll admit it, that was super disappointing. One weakness people point to that I don't agree with, however, is that there are too many Riddler trophies that need the Batmobile. In this case, I think of the Batmobile as another gadget in Batman's utility belt. Gadgets were almost always necessary for Riddler trophies, and of course the shiny new gadget is going to be showcased a lot in that aspect. I personally think that was fine. On the other hand, I do think the straight up tank fights that don't rely on stealth are really fun. They are arcadey and dumb, but it does remind me a lot of the best parts of free-flow combat and how satisfying it can be to finish an encounter with an unbroken combo. The last thing I'll say about the Batmobile before we move on is that I honestly think people focus on it too much when it comes to discussing the overall quality of the game. It has some really fun elements and some not so fun sequences that you need it for. To me, it doesn't make or break the game. The Batmobile is fine, and I think the discussion around it takes focus away from what this game does so damn well. While you can take or leave everything else that comes with Arkham Knight, whether it's the design philosophy or just the Batmobile, the thing that shines brightest in Rocksteady's final chapter of their Arkham trilogy is the story. Many point to the story being a lesser version of Under the Red Hood, since the title character is revealed late in the game to be Jason Todd. But we all saw that one coming, no matter how Rocksteady tried to play it off. But to me, Arkham Knight isn't actually about the Arkham Knight, and is kind of mistitled for the sake of having a cool name with the word Arkham in it. Each game in this series is subtly and not so subtly about some aspect of fear, and the best way to end Bruce Wayne's story as Batman is a simple one: having him truly face his biggest fears. And Rocksteady did that beautifully by having Joker haunt Batman beyond the grave and slowly try to take over his mind. I won't go deep into how Joker was able to do this because honestly it is a lot of comic book mumbo jumbo, but having Joker over Batman's shoulder for almost the entire game creates this very tense buddy cop dynamic, and it serves as a constant reminder for Bruce about how he feels guilt over the death of Joker in Arkham City. But it's not just guilt. Batman has a strict no killing rule, because once he goes down that hole, he has no idea how quickly he could fall down it and turn into people like Harvey Dent, Slade Wilson, or even the Joker. Batman always needs that strict line to not cross, and the entirety of his journey through the events of this game is seeing if that line can be erased now that he feels slightly responsible for Joker's death. A lot of Bruce's fears are usually stemmed from his past failures: dead sidekicks, realizing old friends have lost their way, or even feeling responsible for the death of an enemy. Bruce's biggest fear is that he is one bad day away from becoming the Joker, and that fear manifests into Joker slowly taking over Batman's brain from a mixture of Scarecrow's fear toxin and the leftover Joker blood from Arkham City. And then Bruce's greatest fear happens when the Joker takes over Bruce's mind. But then we see Joker's biggest fears after getting injected with fear toxin again, and it's the most human fear of all: being forgotten. In the end, Bruce takes back control and reminds himself of the legacy he will actually leave behind, and ends up overcoming his greatest fear. The Joker is gone, and he will never become that. He has nothing left to truly fear. A lot of this game is about facing your fears, being consumed by them, and overcoming them. And while yeah, there are plot points that either don't make sense or get really over the top, I do think the overall story in Arkham Knight is the best in the series, and that's just because of how much of a deep dive we get into the fears of Batman and Joker. And we have to say goodbye to both of them with such a big emotional punch, with Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy both giving their best performances as these characters they had been voicing for 23 years. There is so much that has been left unsaid, not just about this game, but the series as a whole in these 4 Batman Arkham videos. I could probably go on for another several hours, and that's because there's just so much to dig deep within each of these games. Thank you for going on this journey with me and letting me talk about specific aspects of each of these games, while understanding I couldn't talk about everything about what makes these games so damn good. But for the final episode of the Arkham Files, I want to end with a thought about the true ending of Arkham Knight. Many of us have obsessed over where the Arkham universe went after the supposed death of Bruce Wayne and who the new Batman could be. Did Bruce return? Did Jason follow in his mentor's footsteps? Could Azrael have fulfilled his destiny of donning the cowl? Honestly, the answer doesn't matter. In a world where Bruce Wayne was revealed to be Batman on live television, the legend of Batman is no longer an idea, but only a man.
Taking that mask off was a big mistake. Now you're just a man, Bruce. You can't scare anyone anymore.
But Gotham always needs a Batman. So what matters most is that Batman has returned, and once again has the most important element of being Batman. Criminals in Gotham are a superstitious and cowardly lot, and the one thing they'll always respond to is fear.
Thank you so much for going on that journey with me, looking back at the Arkham series one last time before Gotham Knights comes out later this week. If you're looking for more Gotham Knights coverage here at KindaFunny, you can check out our preview from a few weeks ago. And until next time, it has been my pleasure to serve you.